All right. Well, with that, everyone, thanks so much for joining us for this Placer AI webinar, Digitally Native's Brick and Mortar Future. We're so happy you joined us. And I'm really especially thrilled, one, because this is a topic that I think is among the most interesting and exciting in all of kind of the conversations we have, not just because of who it impacts on the digitally native side and kind of the direct to consumer side, but also in the wider implications it has for the rest kind of retail and retail real estate more broadly, but also because of the amazing panel we have here today. So I'm thrilled to be joined by Melissa Gonzalez, principal and founder of MG2 and the Lioness Group. Melissa, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And Rebecca Fitz, the AVP of Real Estate at Leap. Rebecca, thank you for joining.
Thanks so much for having me.
And so a quick look at what we're going to do is we're going to start with a very, very brief intro to Placer for those of you who are unfamiliar. We're going to break the webinar down into a few different sections. The first is going to be kind of the why. We're looking at the forces that are driving these trends. Second is going to be the how, the channels that are kind of being leveraged. And the final section is going to be the where these things are going and why. And as always, if you have any questions, we always say there's a Q&A at the end, but we love to have the Q&A throughout the conversation. So if at any point you do have a question, please utilize the Q&A button at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on how you have Zoom configured. And we will try to get to as many questions as possible, either throughout the course of the conversation or at the end. A quick introduction to Placer. So we're a location data company. What that means very, very simply, people vote with their feet. We show you how they vote across the United States to resell locations. We do that by observing a panel of over 30 million devices. We very critically, this is de-identified aggregate data. So we are GDPR and CCPA compliant. We then analyze that data with machine learning and AI algorithms to make estimations on visits to retail locations across the country. And we show that we show these kind of data in a wealth of different reports within our platform on everything from true trade areas, cross-visitation, traffic routes, store rankings, and a whole lot more. If anyone is interested, we do have a freemium version of our product available at placer.ai. So please go check it out. But now, I know we have too many slides to get through, and so I'm trying to hustle through it. But let's start with maybe the most basic. And Melissa, I'll kick off with you. I think digitally native brands that get to the stage of even considering an offline presence have clearly gotten to a certain level, achieved a lot of success. What do you think the biggest selling point is for them to come offline? Like, why are they making that shift?
Yeah, I mean, there's a different opportunity in terms of customer lifetime value when you make that shift. And also it's increasingly extremely expensive to compete online only. So when you launch a company, you have a very specific, target demographic you're going after. And that allows you a little bit to control that ad spend. But when you continue to widen that net, then that cost of acquisition online goes up. And so you want to really lean into the opportunities of enhancing stickiness of that customer relationship. Also the opportunity to increase your average order value. There's a lot of intangible benefits that you start to get. So a lot of the times it's a brand's at a proven concept at scale. Competing online only becomes increasingly expensive, and they're looking to these target demographic geographies to really hone in on that human connection, whether it's cultivating community around the brand, or maybe they have a product where, shopping online only isn't satisfying the answers of fit, right? Or other aspects of consideration of purchase, furniture. There's certain categories where, although technology is advancing and it's allowing people to feel more confident in the ability to make the best decisions online, it doesn't fully give the opportunity to really grow that human connection and that stickiness so that they become lifetime customers to your brand. And so it's usually 10 million sales or more is when we start to see that inflection point happen.
It's super interesting. Rebecca, same question for you, because you're coming at this from such a unique perspective of essentially facilitating so much of that shift for many of these types of companies. What is this? What's the trigger? What's that big selling point where they're saying, okay, now we're ready to come offline. We have more things we can achieve there.
Certainly aligned with Melissa. I think the biggest thing is, if you'd stay online forever, if you could continue to acquire customers in a cost-effective way. But there've been a couple of things that have changed with that make the expense, very, very large. I also think if you want to hit a certain revenue level and you want to you know, pivot further and further, you need to add other channels. So just having one channel, I know we've been talking about omni-channel since it seems like decades. It has been decades, let's be honest. But you want to add other channels, and certainly adding the physical channel feeds into lots of other things as well. But I think the number one reason really is folks are in business to make money. This will allow them to do that. It will allow them to hurdle a certain amount of revenue by adding another channel. But I think it would be remiss to not talk about the touching and feeling and the wanting to have an experience with a brand, and really kind of coming, to the brands. A lot of these DTCs are so good at branding that they have, a fan base almost, and people will, go out of their way once they know that if a brand has enough brand awareness, they'll go out of the way to find them. Again, Warby Parker being a great example, where, people look for the Warby blue and the cool building, etc.
I mean, it's such an important point. I think this kind of overall, like, why do it is becoming increasingly clear and increasingly valued, I think, across the spectrum, not just in the digitally native side, though I do think they've clearly led that charge. But there's also this question of kind of timing, like the why now piece of this. And so, there's, again, like we've heard already lots of reasons why you would do it, but what do you think happened that made it so significant in the last 5 years or so that you're seeing these brands really start to why is it happening now? Rebecca, I'll start with you.
It's a really interesting question. I think there are a couple of reasons. I think they've seen other DTC's success, and I have certainly a lot of, in my world, wanting to follow a Warby Parker, someone who's done it really well, Allbirds, some other folks, and even follow them right down to where they're actually going on the street. So kind of birds of a feather on that. But, there was a whole group of brands that said, either we're never going physical or we're never going to malls. And then all of a sudden, it wasn't all of a sudden, but there was an evolution as they learned about what was happening in the physical world. I also will say this, and I think it's interesting, two other factors, and this is really things that I think about, which is, one, people after COVID do want to go out and have a physical presence. And I was just out last night and coming down in the elevator, and I think it was somebody new to Florida, because 1,000 people are moving to Florida every day. And she said, I want to go out and buy some cute dresses, but I want to physically go to the stores. I don't want to, have it delivered to my house. And then a third thing that I don't think people are thinking about, but I am, or maybe a group of people are thinking about, is I appreciate online shopping for all it is. I do think that there's this environmental impact, and some people are thinking about that as well. And if you look at really the macro environment, it's showing up in politics. People are voting on climate change. I just read an article, silly as it sounds, about why there's so many whales, showing up on shore instead of in the ocean. One of the impacts was the impact of online shopping, which obviously had a huge spike during COVID. So we think there's probably, some socioeconomic, macro level things at play. And then I think there's also kind of the timing of D2C brands going through their own business cycle and, where they are on the bell curve.
That's super interesting. It kind of made it sound like it was the whales were coming online, like offline to go shop, but like I don't think that's the motivation. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but Melissa, also part of this kind of like timing question, I think it's become more and more because there was some earnings calls that weren't the most glowing for some of those leaders that kind of Rebecca mentioned.
Sure.
But I guess this question of like kind of time frame, like, do you think this is temporary? There's a group of companies that reach a certain level of maturity and now they're coming offline, or do you think this is going to be a regular evolutionary pattern for these brands? You hit a certain level, you need to figure out what offline needs for you, and you're going to test it out, and then there'll be that phase. Like, is this a long-term trend, or was this flash in the pan?
I mean, I think that there's always just going to be iterations. That's the consumer's evolving at tremendously rapid speeds, and it's not slowing down, especially with the evolution of technology. And so it's going to continue to force brands and retailers to always evolve, right? And so I think, you've seen a trend to support that, in that the average lease back when was 20 years, then it was 10 years, now it's like maybe 3 years, right? And it's because of a recognition of these brands are going to have to listen to data and learn and iterate based on that information. And what the store needs to be today is likely very different than what it needs to be 5 years from now, right? And so, it's just a little bit a change in the way in which they have to think about physical retail. It doesn't mean it's going away. It might mean they have to take a different portfolio play over time. It might mean, okay, X cities are flagship destinations. They're about community building. X cities are going to make sense for pop-ups. Those are going to be super seasonal. They're going to be about, new collection releases, exciting collaborations and partnerships. Maybe we want to tie into Coachella or whatever that is. And then the size, the format. I think what we're seeing too is, right, the average store size was 20,000 square feet, 10,000 square feet. Now it's like 1,000 to 1,500 square feet. What can happen in a physical space is so different today than it was. A lot of it fostered by technology and also by the changing behaviors of consumers and the purpose of the store. So I think there's always going to be waves and modulations. And I just think that it's recognizing that the purpose of the store is always going to evolve.
I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think it's such an important point of like, I think we never really associated offline retail with being adapting very quickly, but I do think that the pace of adapting is increasing to such an extreme extent that it's enabling brands to rapidly think differently about their locations, to say, okay, we try to pop up here, it was super successful. Should we have a location? Okay, now what? I think it's really interesting. I also feel like there is this, one of the things driving the trend is there's this expanding, when we think about direct to consumer, when we think about digitally native, there's this expanding who, quote unquote, of those who want to get involved. And we think about Nike's obviously been a leader, Ralph Lauren's been a leader in talking about direct to consumer. This graph on the right is showing the true trade area of the M&M store in Orlando. So Rebecca, you'll that's close to home, but it's the insane reach that a candy company gets. And I think, we talk about the different values. I mean, it's one of the big plays. And Melissa, I'll start with you here, but when you think about, whether it's brands thinking about shifting their emphasis from wholesale to direct to consumer, product companies looking to have this strategic location or a strategic pop-up, there are more brands who are kind of considering this channel than they were in the past. And so how different is the conversation, the approach, when you're thinking about Nike looking to go more DTC versus a Warby looking to break into offline for the first time?
Yeah, I mean, when you have a D2C going to offline in the first time, we're having those super early conversations of, what is the opportunity of this touch point? A lot, we don't go right into the conversation. Okay, well, how much inventory are you going to have and what do we need to turn? It's okay. You have this robust network. They interact with you across multiple touch points online. What is the opportunity in offline and what does that customer journey and experience look like? So we're usually having that early conversation, right? If a brand D2C is going to physical for the first time, there's no programming, there's nothing set. When you go to a Nike, they're coming with robust amount of data and information and understanding their consumer. And they're at a point where they're not only going to wholesale, they're thinking, okay, what are the various formats and how do we intersect in different ways? And what does a flagship destination mean? And what does a community store mean? And what is a small format? And what you're seeing them lean into more, right, is the rollout of those smaller formats and understanding they have different inventory strategies that they're going to go after. They have different staffing models that they're going to go after. They're hiring local communities. So it has that neighborhood touch. So they're just at such different trajectories, right? Of how they're entering, where the D2C is literally figuring it out. What is the point of the store for me? What does this touch point mean? What is my programming? And somebody like a Nike is coming with robust data to say, how are we leaning into the different opportunities we have based on all the robust insights that we have? And kind of just leaning into owning more of our customer relationship, knowing that we're moving away from wholesale relationships as our distribution channels.
It's such an interesting thing because you're talking about, again, for a Nike, you have this existing model and you're shifting kind of your balance. Rebecca, for you at Leap, it's much more of you're breaking in, but it's not like these are data-less companies. In some cases, they have tremendous amounts of data. They just have data from a different source. So how much How does the pitch change? Are there different elements that you think really resonate with the digitally native audience? Is there a different type of conversation that has to be had with them?
Absolutely. And it's very interesting. I always say we have a spectrum of customers at Leap, and it's fascinating and enjoyable to talk to all of them. So to Melissa's point, we have True Classic Tees. It's a company that operated on online only, mainly a Facebook audience. And now they've opened stores, but they had a ton of data, maybe not Nike level data, but they had a ton of data, and they're seeing lots of success, again, based on the data, but they had they didn't have wholesale data. They hadn't even done a pop-up. So it was a really interesting conversation, both with them and, interestingly enough, also with landlords, to say they have no history. You don't know who they are, but we'd like to put them here. So it had a really interesting 360-degree conversation on that side of it. And then, I also kind of love, if they're on the far left-hand side, brands that are a little further in, like I'll take a marquee company who has Pee in the Pod and some of the other maternity brands. And they decided, after they got bought by private equity, they didn't necessarily want to be an operator. They wanted to operate differently. So they had all these learnings from what they had done before in a physical environment, and then knew where they wanted to use the platform and how they wanted to use it. And so it was definitely a different, conversation before. And then we've had brands even like Faraday come on and say, the platform's fantastic. We want to do some experimentation outside of our permanent physical stores in major metropolitan areas. Let's do it. So we're really seeing the audience is very interested in physical, but they're also thinking really deeply about how best to do it. And then we've even had we've reversed engineered it and thought about what product can we offer to brands as they're looking at their physical. And one of the things that we came up with is a seasonal product. So, you sell bathing suits, but it's freezing cold half of the year. How do you have a great store strategy for that? And what it is you can go to the same space, secure it, and we'll put something in the winter. And so you can have your ongoing kind of seasonal store. So we're really trying to look at our customer and deliver on, solve problems, obviously, for them, and then deliver something that really makes sense for, a wide variety of customers.
Yeah, I mean, that's a super interesting point. I also love True Classic. I'm a
Excellent.
huge fan, and literally was talking about them at an event that we spoke at last week. As if anyone's not familiar, they're a really amazing company that does like a apparel company that's aimed at kind of, I don't want to say me, but at me. They're like guys with dad bods shirts that are better fitting to help you look better at certain stages of your life. And they are a wonderfully brilliant, funny, and then awesome at quality brand. So shout out for them.
Shout out for them.
Yeah, I mean, but Rebecca, I'll stay with you as we kind of move into like the where. I'll start with you here, Rebecca. What are the unique benefits that an own location provides, and why is this an important part of the strategy? So you say, like, True Classic as the example, why go straight to an own location? That's what is it about that strategy that's so critical?
I mean, for them, I think it was a couple of things, but hurdling revenue that they felt they couldn't do anymore online. I do think there's a essence of touch and feel here too. I mean, you obviously rolled the dice, you knew them before, you got it, you like the product, you probably still may order online. You might not have a store near you, knowing where you sit out of, probably not. But, and so I think for them, that was really the driving force, and then highly, highly data driven. And like most co-founders, maniacal about getting the right place and what they really need. And I think they're a great example of, almost all Leap brands are in their infancy, if they will. They might not like that word, but have not certainly met full maturity or have all the brand awareness. And so in looking at where to put brands, particularly like this, foot traffic certainly matters. They need it. And, you know, the double-bladed sword, I think, with foot traffic is you could say, hey, there are 500,000 people that walk through the World Trade Center Oculus, but what of those 500,000 are going to actually stop and buy your product? And so, you know, the continual, you know, peeling of the onion, if you will, to drop the pin in the right place to do physical, I think is really kind of where it's at. And for us, you know, I think we just, you know, we want to look at so many layers. So it's not just that 500,000 people are coming past. Which one of those are actually your customer? And again, True Classic Tees to, you know, everybody else on the platform are really thinking about that in choosing a physical location. Because if you're going to choose one, you know, make it matter. And then also, you know, how you're using your actual physical location once you get it. And it goes back to the O word, you know, be as productive and omni-channel as you can out of it. And I think, you know, people are, you know, it's no longer just you're taking a 20-year lease, you're putting your product in, you're hanging your shingle, and you're going to see how it goes. You know, we're probably at, I don't want to say the height, because to Melissa's point, there's an evolution going on constantly at using the data and really looking at it to make your physical store the highest productivity it can be.
It's such a great point. And interesting thing was with True Classic, the example when we were talking about them at this event, the example I was giving was I had been to an NFL game with my son in Florida. And I remember sitting there and looking around at this audience, and the only thing I could see was like ads for trucks, Coke, beer, and I don't know, hot pretzels and hamburgers. And I kept on thinking, I was like, True American is kind of targeting me. Here's a stadium of 70,000 people that are filled with lots of me's. Why don't they have like a pop-up at a stadium? Like, doesn't that make so much sense? And that is, by the way, a tier 1 segue to Melissa. When you think about the strategy of opening up these own locations, I think pop-ups play this really incredible role of like, they can be an assist, they can be the core. How do you view it if you're just going to launch these own locations? What do pop-ups mean to kind of adding value to that strategy?
Yeah, I mean, there's various use cases, right? So it depends. Definitely hear you on thinking like, should they be at the stadium? We get asked, should we do it at an airport? You know, there's definitely other logistical challenges in certain areas like an airport or stadium, and different. You know, some of the times the hurdle is more on the operational side, to be honest, than it is on the design build side. But it's understanding if you only have pop-ups, then it's understanding, okay, what do we consider success? Like, why are we doing this? What is our why? What do we consider success? And that informs a lot of your approach towards it. So is it testing the viability of a new city, right? You're going to approach it one way, because then it's like, okay, what metrics are we tracking to decide whether or not this is successful? Is it because it's just for marketing and it's about media impressions and it's about, you know, is it testing a new partnership that maybe we're going to have with the retailer and we want to see what's moving, and then we can decide what to put into production based on this very active kind of focus group conversation that just was had, or maybe it informs store design going forward. So it's like it's something in your toolkit, and it really depends, right? And you have to do that upfront homework at first to really understand what is my why and what do I consider success. Sometimes you already have own locations, and pop-ups are truly to be marketing drivers, right? And so it's understanding that element as well. Sometimes we have brands that do pop-ups and they have tons of wholesale relationships. They're not even looking to walk away from those wholesale relationships, but they understand that the connection they can create in a pop-up will elevate and amplify brand awareness, and it will drive higher sales conversions with their wholesale partner. So it's like, it's a whole mix of scenarios really when you think of pop-ups, but I think you have to think of it as this is like a format in my toolkit. And then I have to think of my why and what I consider success.
But I feel like it really resonated with me, all that kind of the measurement piece of it. And I think that's part of the reason why this is becoming such a significant piece of the puzzle, is because it's not just marketing. I hope it works. Are we actually measuring this? And, we speak to a lot of companies who would tell us that how much budget goes to areas where it's a black hole. They don't know what the impact is, but there is this change in the approaches to these processes. And I think a lot of it is coming from, pop-ups from these DNBs are opening up their first locations because they're already data driven. They're bringing these perspectives to the mix. And it's why this is so important, I think, to the wider retail landscape, is because of that. I want to stick on pop-ups for a second. And Melissa, I'll start with you here. When you touched on a lot of this, but like, when you think of like the unique benefits, you're meeting with a company for the first time, you're saying, hey, why pop up? Like, that's kind of, a very fair question, I think. And like, what is the answer you give? What are like the, obviously every situation is unique, but what are those standard elements that you really need to be thinking about when you want to deploy a strategy like this?
Yeah, I mean, first thing to demystify is pop-ups aren't like, because we're going to go cheap. This is still a brand, this is still a customer impression. You're still having a brand moment. That this is that impression that people are going to walk away with. So I'll start with that. But it is a lower risk commitment, right? Those are two different things. So it's a lower risk commitment in that, right? You're not making a commitment that is years long with a bet that I have it all figured out. This is saying I'm going to have a very, when it's marketing based, I think you should equate it to a very well thought out campaign. Instead of it happening across the digital channel or on a billboard, it's happening in a physical location. But if you look at Stranger Things, this is a very thought out campaign. You're still going to attach metrics to it of what do you consider success, right? If it's, is it sales? Is it growing awareness of the show? Is it bringing more downloads to Netflix, whoever owns it? Like what do you consider success in that, so that you know what to track? When we're doing it with brands, they might continue to always do pop-ups, but they're tracking the halo effect. So when they're thinking about success, it's like, okay, well, what happened to, did I acquire more customers? Did the customers already have spend more with us? Did they return products less frequently? Did they add more items to their shopping cart than they did in the past? Did I see increases of traffic to my website? Those are all the things that you need to track. So you understand that we can no longer think that this is a store, it has its own economic model. Like, yes, financials matter, but it's the overall opportunity that it has to the customer journey that we need to be tracking. And so if you want to consider it for success, yes, you have a budget, but it's not about being cheap, because you get what you pay for. Secondly, location matters, right? I mean, that's like age old, never changes. There are very few categories where you can go anywhere and they'll follow. I would say the sneaker industry has that to their benefit. Like if Puma does a drop, if Nike does a drop, like they can go to the bottom of the ocean and some like sneakerheads will find them. That's not really what happens in most. So you have to still have the same methodologies. Like, where is my shopper today? What is going to make this convenient for them? Are we tying ourselves to an event that's happening? What are the right adjacencies, right? You're still going to have that same conversation. And if you're going to think about budget and you want it to go the longest mile that it can, then you have to think about, what kind of space do I need? It's got to be white box? Does it have the conditions that I can work with? So I'm not spending a lot of money with a GC, but I'm doing it more on I'm more, skinning the space and adding the brand moments that way. And you cannot underestimate your need for a marketing strategy. It could be grassroots. It could be through influencer relationships. It could be tapping your mailing list, but you have to have that thought through, because they're not just going to come because you open doors, and they might come the first day that you open doors. But if you're going for a month, then what's your month-long strategy?
I mean, this is a super important point. I want to, first of all, two questions came in. One was the recording. I'm like, so first of all, this will be available. There's a website, not the Zoom link, but the website. The recording will be available, knock on wood, by start of day Eastern time tomorrow morning. But another question came in about, I guess, some of the logistical side. And Rebecca, I'll start with you here, and Melissa, please jump in if you have any thoughts.
Sure.
How are you seeing landlords better enabling the ability for brands to do pop-ups or to do shorter term deals?
Sure. I say this a lot, and it really is happening, but again, it's an evolution, not a revolution. So I think the tenant landlord relationship is changing for sure. And so a lot of landlords are coming to the table. It's a huge part of the LEAP platform, is that, you know, great second generation spaces or white box spaces. And we say at LEAP, you know, CapEx can be the enemy. And to Melissa's point too, do a really great pop-up, but do a really great pop-up. And a big part of that is going to be the build out. So I do think that landlords, you know, have come a long way. They realize the importance of having new, fresh concepts. Also not having someone there forever. I think about this a lot, which is, if you think about retailers that have been in the business for a long time, are beginning to have some kind of financial strife for whatever reason, but particularly if it goes back to their consumer. So maybe they didn't make any mishaps in getting too much inventory or any of that. If I'm a mall owner, I want to deliver what my end consumer really wants to go and shop. And by having pop-ups, you're able to experiment a little bit with that merchandising. And so I think it's very attractive for the most part to a lot of properties. There are some properties who want, you know, to have someone in there pretty regularly, and they know their merchandising and they know who they're delivering to their consumer. But the world has really changed, and landlords are willing to experiment. And I think also for the right brands, or what they feel or hear from their consumer is the right brand, they're going to be willing to come to the table. And again, I think there's a lot of evolution there in tenants having more of a voice and asking for things, and for landlords kind of proposing things. So it's been a really nice place to sit. And even coming out of COVID, nobody really knew how to negotiate. And so if you have those hard conversations, some of these conversations, now that we're out of it and what we'd like to do, to me seem much easier.
That's interesting. Melissa, any thoughts on that topic?
And the landlord, right, the question out. So I think it depends on the market, honestly. Like, I've seen some markets where the industry, I guess is the right term, is a little savvier in this conversation. And there's other markets where we've entered where it's been a real uphill battle for them. They scratch their heads like, why would I ever do this? Even today's day and age. So it's not, market agnostic. I think when you're dealing with, for example, also like larger development teams, groups like Simon and Brookfield and stuff like that, they have a portfolio of spaces. They're looking to cultivate relationships with the next up and coming brand, and they understand that this is a way for them to be able to do that. So when you're negotiating, I think with more national landlords, you have more of that ability to be creative with them. If you're negotiating with more of that kind of mom and pop, they own one or two locations, they're really holding out for that long-term lease, it's probably going to be a little bit more challenging to have those conversations and really them to see the value in agreeing to a shorter term tenancy.
That's super interesting. Shop and shops are very interesting. We're gonna skip, because I'm already sad that we're gonna be missing out on some of my favorite topics and ones I really want to hear your thoughts on. So let's jump to cities versus suburbs, because I think this is interesting all the time. I think it's especially interesting with this topic. And Melissa, I'll start with you here. How does shop and shops fit into the wider digitally native DTC strategy, and what is the potential? I'm sorry, I'm giving you the question for shop and shops. Cities versus suburbs.
I know. I was like, we can roll.
Yeah, I was like, no, don't. Yeah, I mean, we can talk about it still. When you think about how people have moved and what the shift has been, and we hear this in a lot of other segments, how the suburbs have become more. Does it change? Because I classically associate pop-ups with malls and major cities, right? I don't necessarily always associate it with my suburban strip mall. Has any of that changed in the last few years?
Absolutely. That was definitely, I think, a big outcome of COVID. And there's many brands that do pop-ups in the suburbs that are tremendously more successful than going into urban environments. And, I think this goes back to the earlier conversation too about the um, the trend of brands signing shorter term leases, 3 years versus 20 years, for example, because there's shifts like this, right? That
Mm.
you're not fully predicting at the time when you're signing a lease. But yes, as we've gone into a more hybrid work mode that is probably here to stay, you're seeing a big change in how people are spending their time. They're willing to live further away from an urban area because they're not commuting in every day. They're spending more time in those destinations. Um, this is, they're going there for entertainment versus going into an urban environment. I think the destinations that are more lifestyle centers are definitely more successful because of that. They have great mix of not just retail, but F&B, and they have big kind of outdoor communal spaces for the kids, for the adults. So you're seeing a lot of brands make that move, knowing that at the end of the day, that's where their customers gravitating to. And many times they're doing it with discretionary income that they're reallocating. So they have those dollars to spend. And it's been an overlooked segment of the market. So there is a lot of opportunity, especially in more affluent suburban areas where they're urbanites that are coming, and they're like, there's voids that need to be filled of, how they want to spend their time, and they want these outlets to be able to go to. So I think the suburbs are actually a pretty big opportunity still.
I mean, Rebecca, we were talking before about True Classic, probably too much, but like, another one is like Untuck It. Like, I'm like, why? You should be all over the suburbs right now. That your audience, there's this chunk that is moving to the suburbs that screams out that audience. I think it's so interesting. I mean, Rebecca, when you talk to retailers, how do you think they should approach the question of suburbs, cities, different types of environments like that?
I mean, we always go to the data first, and it's interesting because, I mean, the one, it's not really a hiccup, but I have to remind myself constantly, this is where people are having their product sent. You're assuming it's their home. And then are they willing to travel to you, or where are they spending their time, which again, a huge AI kind of placer, not question, but why we're looking at it. And so I think there are a couple of things that are going on. One is, if you're really paying attention to the data and not just a voice of a brand, which we certainly are always listening to, I think sometimes they think, I want to go in on a high street first and then into a mall. And I think we're trying to push on, and I would say a mall in the suburbs, we're definitely trying to lean in more on the data and what truly makes sense. And also, there have been many shifts, to Melissa's point as well. So do you have to start on the street? There's captured foot traffic within malls that we have probably a better understanding of rent comps, better understanding of sales comps within a shopping center in the suburbs than we do, on a city street. So I think there are things there that, we can lean into more and more with brands so that they have an understanding. And again, it's kind of that question. It's like a 4-year-old, a want or a need. You want to really look at your data, even though you might think you're a brand that belongs on a high street and should be, hip and cool, et cetera. It goes to kind of the different reasons of why you're going into physical. So if it's particularly a brand play, you certainly can go into the city. But I do feel like cities, certainly with the change in office, and I'm aligned, I don't know if it will ever go back to what it was, kind of don't seem like the exact places you should be. And obviously multifamily work, play, live is, having a moment for sure. For all of the reasons Melissa, stated, you're not going to an office every day. You have some expendable income. How do you want to spend it? And what do you?
No, I apologize for cutting you off. That, I mean, it's such an important point, and I think it kind of touches on, the way our conceptions about these areas are changing, because, again, we think about 3 years post-pandemic now, or 3 years since the start of the pandemic, excuse me. virtual work is clearly like a thing that's staying. Like to what extent, who knows, how will it bounce back? Maybe, but it's something that's really significant. It's changed areas entirely. Rebecca, another element though is kind of not city versus suburb, but it's also what format type. Are you in a mall? Are you in a lifestyle center? You're in a strip center? Are you in a downtown area? How do you view kind of the shifts that are necessary from an owned retail strategy, depending on the format you choose?
Well, and I mean, I think there's a major shift, which is generally smaller, and you're seeing that obviously from even the big guys. But to me, that's almost brand specific. And I think, also back to the omni-channel, look at your store holistically and your space and your format. What do you want to get done in that space? And I think with physical, there is something that's a little hard about pivoting. So really think about those objectives up front, because if you start out and you're a jewelry brand and you take a very small space, you don't need a lot of space, and then you decide you want to have jewelry classes, adding on to that space is harder than, retracting it. And so I think I'm thinking about format, usually specifically for a brand. But I also have boxes in our portfolio that this should fit any Leap profile brand. They should be able to come in, use this box to the height of omni-channel capabilities, and have a success. So I think format, if you're holding down your costs and you're taking a risk, obviously, and you're paying per square foot, there is this tendency to go smaller, and not to necessarily, still be able to use it at its highest productivity, but that you don't need, 5,000 square feet, even in the world we're living in, or, 10,000 or 20,000.
Melissa, for you, when you think of, and we've talked about this a bunch, like you mentioned this too, pop-ups is this kind of like ideal format for testing, like not doing things cheaply, but for kind of being able to understand, is there long-term potential? When you think of like the key way to do that, because I wonder, how do you view formats within that testing structure? Is there a different way you want to test out a mall versus the way you want to test out a downtown area? How much do these strategies change in between formats?
So you mean it's still a pop-up, but just designed differently? I mean,
or even
sure,
just located differently. Is like a pop-up in a mall, how different is it than a pop-up in like a lifestyle center?
Well, that's interesting that you differentiate the two. One is a mall and one's a lifestyle center, but it all depends on where your customer is. Like, not every mall is the same, not all your targets are the same. There's a lot of opportunities if you're in the certain cities, states, everybody shops at the mall. Certain geographies, that is not the spot that they go to. So it's not just like a general answer, you know what I mean? Like the way you're going to approach Vegas, for example, is going to be different than the way you approach Dallas, would be so different than the way you approach Manhattan. So it's really understanding like the opportunity in that geography and how you want to approach it. And it also depends on what you want to do with it, because you could be in a great mall and you have more of that glass box, right? Or you could be at the Grove, and you can have their glass box, which is like 200 square feet, and it knocks it out of the park because it's a Class A lifestyle center that's highly coveted, that's curated with amazing brands, right? And you could go there with almost even limited marketing programming and still do well. You could take that same exact approach and go to the Midwest in a mall, and it's not going to have the same. So it's kind of like you have to really understand the opportunities in each of those geographies, how people are shopping, how your target customer is shopping. Take that lens first and foremost, and then start thinking through, okay, what's the right format within these different geographies?
It's I feel like the level of complexity is really important to double down on, because I think one of the things that gets, when you think about the conversations, and some of them were not overly positive around some of those digitally natives who have gone public and their struggles, some of the challenges they have faced offline, think it's kind of an unfair premise when you think a lot of these brands, there are growing pains. This is complicated. It's hard to do. Just because it's important and necessary doesn't mean it's
Sure.
easy. I think it's the same thing with like, there was this idea of like, oh, if you want to do e-commerce, have a website and then you're done. Like, no, that's not it. It actually requires a lot of work and focus and strategy to do these things right. Now, unfortunately, we have run up against it. But I want to, I mean, time flies when you're having
Always
awesome
goes fast.
yeah, I mean,
It always
but
goes
and
fast.
to be fair, it's my fault because I knew this one was going to be great, and it's we've all had the chance to speak before, but I want to thank Melissa and Rebecca, both of you, so much for joining us. This was as much fun as I expected it to be, and really appreciate you both taking the time. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. This was we really love it that you take time out of your day to be with us, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of the day and rest of your week. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Have a great day, everyone.